Model capabilities are very jagged, and models excel in different domains and different, like verticals. So like, I think this like tells you like a completely different picture. Before, we had one giant leaderboard for WebDev. So what kind of sparked the brand new categories?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Let me show an illustration with you. Basically, building we call it taxonomy, usually in research term, is very classical machine learning problems. So usually we will start with the embedding, just like we encode everything we have on the user's prompt, and whether we want to include the model response is depending on us. And then we use a modern embedding-based model here, and then we can get a vector. So why we want to actually make it a vector is because we can better represent it in different space. So because you can think of a user prompt could contain a lot of things. For example, you will have what the things they want to build, what kind of the style they want, what kind of the output they expected to show, like visually, whether they want a scholar or they actually want in which languages, and etc., etc. So there are a lot of like different things that we can capture in your user prompts. So a modern way we usually like to do is having an embedding, and then based on embedding, we measure the distance, like we have in this figure. The main thing we want to build is the cluster, just to show an initial understanding of like how, if we represent everything in large scale, how the prompts are close to each other on the embedding space. But later on, when we have this prompt, it's actually not expandable, just like there's no interpretabilities between on these clusters. So we actually need to name it. So how can I do this naming is we call it like prototype extraction. That is, we provide some examples for each of the clusters. And then based on these examples, we prompt language model to say, hey, generate a summary based on all these examples we see. And then definitely we need to do some sampling process to make sure there's no statistically bias. But later on, if we do until these steps, there's still several issues. So this is the fun thing I want to introduce to you today. So first thing is actually a lot of prompt, there are multiple angle, as I mentioned before. So you can imagine like if we just build a embedding or vectors, what will be a strong things that present if everything is written in Russian?
Yep.
Essentially, they will be much easier to cluster together because they are from the same languages. So this is one thing that could bias on the clustering or the embedding mechanisms. So we will have like languages. Another thing is similar to what we have in the category. We have the user intent. So user intents include several things. For example, the first thing is what they want to build. And the second thing is like what style they want. And also there are some like the more salient things. For example, what specific component they want. They could be spend a lot of like the text describing like, I want a button look like triangle outside, but square inside. And there's a lot of things that it's all users' different preference.
Yes.
And these are actually something that in a larger scale, there's a lot of things it's hard to control. And besides languages, user intents, there are also something that, for example, the use case they actually want. For example, some interesting use case is like they will try to optimize existing HTML, for example, just like they will just copy the full HTML and saying like, I think this current HTML doesn't look good enough, fix it. So, or like, oh, I think this current HTML lack something that they are not satisfied. These are all very practical examples. And you can imagine like, because the HTML has a fixed format. So if you use an embedding-based method, basically they will be clustered all together. And it's hard to get this from the embedding-based models. So what we want to do here, after we get this LM label generation, it requires a decision process from a research perspective. That is what we want to present to the audience. That is both meaningful to the model labs because they are the LM builders, and to the audience, like what actually the use case that is help users to make decisions on which model I want to select. So it ends up our decision here is to focus more on the user intent. Just like, hey, the real use case is what kind of the website we want to build. But definitely this is not a final decision for like, hey, just like for all the core arena going forward, this is the 7 category we care. So this is just like the initial phase.
This is super interesting. I wanted to double click on exactly like how you use your framework that you described to get the final 7 list of categories, because there's like, you know, like games and simulations and like brand informational sites. Like what have you seen in the data? How did you like fine tune this process to kind of refine that and get these 7 categories?
So there are typically at least 2 things that we want to optimize in a traditional like ML doing this like taxonomy or topic modeling stuff. The first thing I want to mention is the coverage thing, because we are data, just like data centric. All the thing that we are built from is our users data. And then so we want to cover as much as possible in our data, and then they are precise enough. So we care about the quality, and then we care about the coverage, about what we have. So this is the first thing about the coverage. The second thing is about whether the boundary are clear enough. So we don't want a description when we try to extract a category that is like A or B or C or D or E or F. Just like there's tons of like just like sloppy definitions. We want everything to be concise, fluent, and then natural to be clustered together. So to make this happen, we actually build this process of like, we have this initial generation, and then we have what we decide here is we have the user intent. It's our final thing. We write a prompt to say, I provide some initial data we have there that is could be migrate into different kind of user intent in a cluster. We ask the language model to do the prompting, just like polish the prompting so that you can make sure the prompt content are concise, natural together. And then we have our data. After we finish this, or like we can say we supervise the language model to do what we actually aim to take. And then we really test the tagging results. That is, we send the definition, what we want to extract, what we want to tag to the models that we really do the testing. So it's more like the experimental part. It's very similar to when we do a physical testing, then we have some definition and we really execute the things, and then let's see what exactly the result look like. And then this is how we test the coverage. And so this coverage thing, we can actually measure it. Just like we can measure like, oh, we already cover 80% of our data. And then, so after we have this coverage results, we will take a look at what are the less 20% of the data that is not being covered. And then we will draw some samples from the not covered part, and then use these results that are not covered. And then we prompt the language model again, say, are there actually some obvious examples that we miss in the current definition? So we further polish the definitions again. Our human work here is to double check what's the result there. And then we use the language model to rewrite the prompt. And then going forward, we are trying to do this. So actually in our blog, we mentioned not only the coverage and the boundary clearance, we also care about the third thing is interpretability. Interpretability is basically just like what I mentioned of actually for the user's perspective, you need to make the title very clear.
Yep.
And then they are very naturally suitable to be clustered together. And this is how we do on the manual work, on just like, whether this is a sense of like they should be actually covered together. And then the other thing is, because we are accessing the tool we had. So in the back end, we have designed several tools built by you. Like, for example, we have web search, we have like screenshot takers, things like that. We also need to consider like whether the category we bring can specifically utilizing some tools that we bring. Yeah. And then we also need to take a consideration of that. Just like, for example, I want to mention we have a category that is rebuilding or
like reference-based
design.
Yeah.
So actually for that part, you really need to have some memory about what specific icon or you need to search online. Yeah. So web search will become a very important tool to use for that specific categories.
That sounds great. I think like it's in a very interesting point that you bring up on how like our actual harness and tools can influence the actual end categories, because the harness that we create can influence what the model is capable of actually doing. For like the reference-based design, web search and web fetch are extremely powerful. For let's say like a brand informational site, for example, like a landing page, like a marketing page, it may want to use like generate image for, creating different assets or something like that. I'm curious, like, how does this pipeline support like the multi-use case like prompts that users are asking on the Arena?
Right now, the category we built, it's still limited, I will say. We monitor the changes of prompt through the category things. Yeah. So as we see in our blog here, how prompt category distribution shifts over time. So you can see here, for example, initially we have a lot of like the gaming on the percentage. Right. Although the full demand or full volume doesn't drop, but we see that actually the percentage of gaming are actually dropping. And
that's also pretty interesting. Yeah.
And also simulations here. But we see a lot of like brand marketing and information website that keep growing, similar to consumer products. What's your take on this?
So it seems like a lot of what I would group as like more like production facing apps and concepts are the ones that are like increasing over time. Like I think one more interesting point that we've seen is how games and simulations are quite difficult to make. Frontier models still are not the best at creating games and simulations. Like when you prompt it and you give it, hey, I want to make like, like let's say like a game of Snake or a game of like Connect 4. It's very common to see nowadays still that the model can't, one-shot it. Even though like these are games that have been around for so long and the rules are so like well-defined, there's like very little ambiguity, that there's just a lot of components that go into making like a well-formed game. And it's very obvious when something doesn't work. It's more blurry for like an informational website because, it's, subjective, and there's no like right or wrong. But I feel like for something like a game, there's a very obvious right or wrong on how the game should be played, which is why we see, like perhaps like it's going down, and also like there's no like necessarily direct like utility for a game thing. Yeah.
I look at a lot of like examples we have on the game part. Initially, there's a lot of like interesting trials on whether a model can do this, can do that. Can you have like an angry bird? And then can actually a bird can be shoot out. Functionally correct. Right. Yeah, but moving forward, we see a lot of like AI being used in like their real use case, daily works. So I think moving forward, if like for example, the brand market and information website keep growing, we actually need to bring more like fine-grained capabilities on, how are actually these brand and website are developing, what specific model are good at specific angles. For example, we see like GPT 5.5 high is actually pretty good at content creation tools, simulation, gaming. These are very hard problems, but on like the brand marketing and information website, they are probably just not put too much focus, and then they are not as just like strong comparing to other categories.
I think these like radar plots are super interesting to like deep dive into because it kind of like paints a much different story. One model may excel, you know, so much in like in one category, but maybe not so much in another. But that's okay if your intent is to build, let's say, you know, like a consumer product and platform application. Like even though like we see that Gemma 431B is not super high ranked on the overall, but it is, you know, super high ranked on something like consumer product. This is like almost like a decision tool. Like I can use this and the leaderboards to figure out, okay, if my use case is X, I should be using, you know, this model Y because it's quite performant in that category. Because I think like a lot of like building websites and apps, you're focusing on a specific niche. You want to pick like a model that really excels in that niche because you may not care about every single category, right?
Yeah, especially also in our website, we also have the Pareto on like the price and speed.
Totally.
So we can combine all this information together for the users to make their best decisions.
100%. It'll be curious to look back on this like 3 months from now or 6 months from now and see how things have shaped up. Because I'd imagine like, you know, like what the things that people are building are going to look like very different potentially. And the types of like emerging categories may also be different.
Yeah.
Do you have like some, you know, like predictions on like what those could look like, you know, in the coming months?
I think one specific category I feel is interesting when I was building is the data analytic applications.
Yes. Yeah. There we go.
Because I use like a lot of like AI tool to analyze the data to monitor things from day to day. I think there's a lot of use case because like AI models are already good at processing this data. And for enterprise people, they actually use this tool from from their day one, I believe. So I think we need to dive into like what actually these like data analytic application can combine with like a brand marketing website. Just like they can have a very good interaction between these two categories to make a very live dashboard on how their company is growing, like and then what's the high stake problems they were trying to solve, and then what are their flagship products they're trying to generate. So I think they are all more like cross categories. I believe they will come out soon because the capability of AI is growing.